Hi, in this short video demo, we're going to cover a brief introduction to using the TestRail API, which is how most teams integrate TestRail with their CI/CD tools or test automation. So to use the TestRail API, the first thing you're going to do, you'll need administration privileges. And let's go into site settings, and we're going to enable API. That will enable the API for the entire instance. Great. Now, to set up authentication, right now I'm not using any kind of SSO. The way that TestRail supports authentication for APIs is typically just using basic authentication on the API side, on the HTTP request side. But for additional security, it's always recommended that you create an API key to use instead of your password for that authentication. All right, so we'll go ahead and save that setting. Now let's take a look. You can see my email address, and then I have the API key saved. So what we'll do, in this example, we'll go ahead and set username and password, and you can tell here, well, you may not be able to tell, but I'm using the API token instead of my actual password. All right, so let's say you wanted to update the results from your test automation to TestRail, and you wanted to send that via the API because it's a lot faster than updating them manually. The first step would be to get the available test result statuses that you have in your TestRail instance, because you can customize those to whatever statuses your team uses. You want to make sure you get those first. So let's go ahead. Here we have the host name for the TestRail Cloud instance that I'm going to be using. And then we're going to use the get statuses endpoint to retrieve what statuses do we have available to then be able to store in a dictionary. As we're running our test automation, and based on the statuses, we can set those values and send those values back to TestRail correctly. So this is just a simple get request. For the parameters here, you don't have to specify anything other than just making sure that you have the host name copied. So let's go ahead and send that request. So it looks like we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 statuses. These, in fact, are the 5 default statuses in TestRail, where you can see that 5 is a failed status and 1 is passed. All right, so now what happens if we're actually running our test automation and we want to send that information back to TestRail? So you can add results one by one. So for example, if I wanted to add results just for this specific test in this specific test run, it has a unique test ID, and that's what I would use here. I would specify that in the add result API. And in this case, because I'm sending actual information about this test case, I'm going to specify that information in the body of the request. So here you'll see the parameters. There's nothing else in the parameter or in the URL line. I'm going to be using my authorization. For example, since we know now that 1 is passed, we'll say this test passed. And we'll get a response that confirms that the result was added. Now let's take a look at TestRail. Go ahead and refresh, and sure enough, it's passed. That said, if you're working with test automation across tens or even hundreds or even thousands of tests, it's typically going to be a lot more efficient for you to use an endpoint like the add result for cases endpoint. And the add result for cases endpoint, let's actually look at this other test run here. In this case, all you're going to need is the test run ID, which you can locate either in the URL or in the UI. Let's go ahead and grab it from the URL. In this situation, we're going to need to specify which test cases we've added to this test run. So let's go ahead and grab, this is test 16816, which is associated with the case 4730. So let's go ahead and grab that. We'll add that as our first. And then let's go ahead and add back real quick. And then we'll grab the test case associated with the second test in this demo run. The reason you might want to do it this way is because oftentimes, especially with test automation, you're going to be testing the same test cases with different tests over time. For example, you might want to test a certain test case for a certain version that you are testing, or a certain configuration, or a certain operating system that you're testing on, or a certain test date, or something like that. So each time you create a new test against a test case, it will create a new test ID. So that's not usually the most scalable solution when you're trying to set up your test automation to work with the TestRail API, and you want to be able to send test results associated with certain test cases over time. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to build a results object. It's a list of different cases. We've specified this run. So what this is going to do all at once, when we send this over, it will send the results and the comments for both of the cases in that, or both of the tests in that run that were associated with these cases. And we'll take a look at that here in just a second. All right, now let's take a look at the response. So here we have, from TestRail, we have a 200 OK response that indicates both tests were updated successfully. Here you can see this test failed. And then if we look at test 16817, we have this test passed and the version number and elapsed time associated with that result. So hopefully this short demo gave you a little bit of an introduction to how to use the TestRail API, some of the different questions you might have about authenticating the TestRail API, and some strategies that you might use to upload results from your test automation to TestRail using the TestRail API.